Hello, welcome to another episode of the IT Wildcard. This is in response to a very interesting question I had, which asked me about my favourite subjects in IT and also my least favourite. So I've decided to pick 5 of each, roughly, and I'm going to riff around them, explain a little bit about, contextually, why they're my favourite or least favourite. Some, are related to IT, but they may be more on the soft system side of things. And at the end, I'll just talk a little bit about what I'm working on this week in terms of projects. So first up is data wrangling. I love data wrangling. I love the whole process of transforming, mapping data from one form of data to another, be it between file types, be it within programs, be it within data structures. It's always fascinated me. It might be also why I'm fascinated by things like substitution ciphers, things like that. But yeah, I love data wrangling, whatever people want to call it, data munging. I sometimes call it data durdling, because for me it's really strange. Once I've done the wrangling bit, I actually lose interest a little bit, and don't really, I have to do the stuff after that, but the data wrangling stuff is the stuff that I actually enjoy the most. Next thing I've always enjoyed is scripting languages. Back in the early days of DOS, scripting in there. And I suppose a particular use I like using, or have used scripting for over the years in combination with configuration files, is automation. Be it automation of data manipulation, data wrangling, or automation of installation, or doing things like using scripts to tweak resources. I don't know if anybody watching these videos worked on computers around the time of DOS, when you really had to roll your sleeves up and work in the config files to manage stuff like memory and things like that to get your games to work. And so it had to have a real good understanding of batch files. And so yeah, I love messing around with any form of scripting. The other thing that interests me is failure analysis. And this is I'm going to talk about failure analysis from 2 different angles here, like why I enjoy it, but also why I hate it. So what I enjoy about failure analysis is using failure analysis to inform systems. So using it as although it's a reactive method, using it then to take proactive steps. And I've become exposed to failure analysis and performing failure analysis through my exposure mainly to quality control techniques, and then applying it to IT. Now, there are certain other areas that I am interested within that. So things like forensic inquiry. I did a little short forensic science course with the Open University as part of a certificate in contemporary science, just for fun. It's just before I came to Canada, actually. And I just loved that. And I remember as a kid, one of my first occupations I wanted to go into before anything else was forensic science. That's something that I always wanted to explore. So I think that's probably where it comes from initially, is that picking apart to solve a problem, which then can, in my particular instance, help you stop other problems from happening. And we'll come on to the other side of the flip side of failure analysis, or failure that I don't particularly enjoy dealing with. Now, another area, and this ties in with my obvious love of comparative programming languages, and that's to do with paradigms, but more specifically teaching to paradigms. And what I mean by that is, when I teach or train people, underneath it all, I try and teach concepts and thought patterns, because I find it's really helpful, and I find that paradigms and thought patterns can be reapplied elsewhere fairly easily. And a good example for me is, a lot of people, probably more when I was working in IT at the time, prior to me retiring, a lot of people were impressed by my ability to find features and functions in programs that were fairly new in the organisation. And that's because I learned a certain set of concepts and thought patterns connected with where features and functions commonly were. So that whole, that fascinates me, the teaching of broad paradigms, concepts to help you understand things you haven't seen yet. And I often use the term artfully vague, and sometimes that's useful as well, to sometimes paint in a very broad brush to help get certain broad concepts, certain thought patterns of thought across to people, which then helps them further down the line when they might come across something that they haven't experienced before. So yeah, I love thinking in paradigms, but also teaching in paradigms. I mean, I love teaching and training generally. This is a strange one. Setting up computer systems. I don't know what it is. I've set up thousands of computer systems over the years. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration, hundreds. But yeah, probably over 1,000 of all different types. And for some reason, I just love, particularly like en masse, where you sort of stack them up like pancakes, and, either have some ingenious script or you push out a deployment script. I just love doing that sort of thing. Or just wiping machines and reinstalling them with new software. And then optimizing it as well, just working out how can I get the best running, like cleanest install to use as a platform. And that probably comes from my days of working in DOS, where you had limited resources to work with. So I think that's where that comes from. And as I said, that's connected in with process optimization as well. So, the more installs you do, the more you start to refine your technique to do it. And, when you're doing, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever computers in a week, or whatever it is, or over the course of a month, whatever time frame, just doing those things over and over and over again, you're constantly looking for small improvements each time, or planning small improvements to do on your next deployment, or whatever that might be. Now, the things that I don't like, and it's not so much I don't like them, but I find them a challenge. And they take more work often than I would like to put in. And one is wrestling with certain programming paradigms. And there's an underlying problem I have, and maybe a lot of people have the same issue out there, and this was particularly a problem with, like myself, where I learn in a particular set of languages, and then when you have to transfer over to another programming paradigm, how do you I wouldn't say unlearn, but don't use the same structuring or whatever the paradigm. It's really difficult. Let me give a concrete example. So the first time I tried to learn object-oriented programming, the thing I had to do is think in a completely different paradigm to do that. Now, fortunately, when I learnt it, the programming language I learnt in was, and now it's gone. Let me think for a moment. Smalltalk. And the good thing about Smalltalk is it forces you to write in and design and everything in using the object-oriented paradigm. But I found it such a struggle. It's the first time ever I've come close to packing up a course with the Open University. It was just so challenging. But it was good because I had no choice but to write, using those paradigms because of the structure of the language. But that is a problem I always wrestle with, is when I'm working in another programming paradigm. One is trying not to use the other paradigms as a crutch, and sort of doing this weird hybrid programming. Another one where it was interesting was the first time I tried to program in Clojure, which is a function programming language. In fact, a good one to try is Lisp, because that's a good change. So that to me is some things that I enjoy less, just because it is just unbelievably challenging. I mean, you get there in the end, but yeah, when you have to work in a programming paradigm and you want to try and throw off those, paradigm chains from other languages, that's really very challenging indeed. Herding cats. Okay, this is more of a person-orientated problem. I'm not sure anybody that works in IT comes across this occasionally, where you almost see these futile attempts to control and organise certain groups of individuals. I have a very I'm not one of these IT people that has a very disparaging view of users. Having worked most of my life on the coalface of IT, I have a lot of respect for users. I know a lot of IT people are very disparaging towards users. I'm not. However, I do recognise that trying to herd cats in certain circumstances, particularly a certain type of user that thinks they know more than they do, there's an effect, isn't there? I can't remember what it's called now. Something Kruger effect. Put in the comments if you can remember what that is. And that also makes them inherently more uncontrollable. So anything like that. The other thing that seems incredibly frustrating, and why whenever I've done any big training programs, of which I've been involved with quite a few, it's always nice when you have a separate project manager who just looks after the logistics of getting everybody to the lessons on time, or the lectures on time, or wherever. Because that can be quite challenging when people don't turn up, and then for various reasons you have to offer some repeat training. Happens a lot internally in organisations where certain people, certain users, expect you to work around them, and because of their position in the organisation, there's not much you can do about that. But it is very frustrating to have to run multiple training regimes over and over again, because you're attempting to pull in these errant kitties into doing training, which is going to benefit them. So herding cats. And the other thing is, and this is connected with systems failures. And here, the flip side is avoidable system failures. I find very frustrating when you know that it could have been avoided. Tied into that is also something that I call doing front-end fixes for back-end problems. So that's where there's a back-end problem and certain individuals are dragging their heels for whatever reason, and it falls on you as the person who is dealing with the users every day to come in with a front end fix, and then that front end fix becomes the fix when it shouldn't be. The back end bit should be fixed. And I think sometimes, rightly or wrongly, this might be tied in with the Peter Principle. And this is really clever. There was a sitcom, I think, called this. And the Peter Principle is a concept of management developed by Lawrence J. Peter, so it's named after them, which observes that people in hierarchy tend to rise to a level of respective incompetence. Employees are promoted based on their success in the previous jobs until they reach a level at which they are no longer competent, as skills in one job do not necessarily translate to another. And this, to me, is often tied in with system failures, where you have clearly individuals who are out of their depth, and either they're aware of it or they're not. Maybe they don't even know it. And I've been very mindful of this myself. It is know thyself. So know at which point you could potentially reach your Peter Principle. Now, I'm all for people, obviously doing challenging things. But I sometimes find a situation where you get someone who clearly is out of their depth, and no matter what they do, with the approaches they're using, they're not going to improve. It's basically, they need to rethink. And in the same token, I do believe that you can create your own resources and definitely improve. But sometimes, for whatever reason, you might get to that point. It's a wonderful diagram here, actually. So that it's all sort of interlinked with avoidable system failures caused by lack of knowledge about things. So that's another thing that I dislike intensely in IT. I don't particularly like computer hardware. This sounds strange, or it doesn't interest me that much. Some people love it, but I am interested in older technology, and I'm also interested in wringing as much as you can get out of an existing piece of technology. But yeah, I don't obsess over the most recent CPUs or graphical cards or stuff like that. Mainly, probably because I don't do a lot of really high-end graphic intensive stuff. That might be part of it. I used to be in the early days because, there was only so much power you could wring out of a DOS machine running, 4 meg of RAM or whatever. I did become a bit more interested with hardware. And of course, when I worked for myself in the 2000s, I had to keep up to date with everything because I was never sure what was going to turn up when I went onto a client's, around someone's house or on premises if it was a firm. So I had to be fairly familiar with, whatever the various levels of hardware that you might find, mainly in a personal computer environment. But yeah, hardware is not something that particularly interests me currently. And I'm trying to even think if there's anything corner casey. I quite like more like music tech, but even that's a rabbit hole. Once you start buying pedals and racks and stuff like that, it doesn't stop. So I learnt fairly early on to try and nip stuff like that in the bud. So yeah, computer hardware, not one of my most fascinating things. Okay, the next thing I'm going to have to explain in two parts, because so as a programmer, I think maybe there's some people out there that love debugging. I don't particularly enjoy debugging myself. But where I really detest it is where it's in combination with, I'm not going to, this is unfair, I'm not picking on VBA. I've used actually VBA a lot over the years, but more in the 90s into the early 2000s. But it really comes from when I worked on a 4GL, fourth generation language system, that was built around a database, as back then a lot of 4GLs were. And the problem is a lot of it was event driven, of which I'm sure if you've used be it VBA you'll come across. And the term I'm using here is a bit loosely, like there's event driven like programming languages that sometimes mean something slightly different. What I'm talking about here is that there's certain pieces of code that you can tie to certain events. So there might be a piece of code that runs when you click on a button, those sort of things. And the problem I found was a lot of that stuff was buried away in these applications. So these programming languages were tied to a certain application. Like, if you were trying to do clever things in Access or another database system which had an associated programming language, if someone else had been in there and done the coding, it was sometimes difficult to find where they'd put the code, because sometimes there were multiple choices for events, and sometimes people would put it in the wrong one. And there'd be all these wonderful ones where, does the event trigger when you click it, or when something else happens, or when you lose his focus, and all these other things. And trying to find where they are in the system can be quite tricky. And I think, there's a wider problem I have here actually with programming environments, where in order to take the strain off of the coding, some of the under the bonnet stuff is hidden away and it's difficult to find. So that's that whole problem with, if anybody's worked in a 4GL back in the day, they'll know what I mean. But it is, I find, something else that manifests itself in VBA quite a bit. But it is a particular problem more when you're going in to debug someone else's code in there. And so that's really my 5 picks for things that I most enjoy doing connected with IT, and things that I enjoy the least. The list could be a lot longer than they are, but I thought that was a good starting point. Let me know in the comments section if there's anything there you want me to talk a bit more about, or there's any pet hates or pet likes that you have within IT. I'd be interested to know. In terms of stuff I've been working on at the moment around the time I'm recording this video. So I'm revisiting 2010 a lot before, and you might wonder why. Well, I've noticed that, and this happened when I was putting together my podcast, the music podcast, and I got to the 2010s and I was actually having real trouble finding contemporaneous albums and then tracks to play. And I thought I'd actually revisit the 2010s, because the 2010s, so in end of 2009 was when I moved to Canada, and my consumption of music changed as a result also of having Spotify, and also not being exposed to the UK charts anymore. Although I did carry on buying some UK music magazines, I wasn't quite so incentivized, because I wasn't listening to UK focused music every day. It then became more like Canadian music by artists, which, there's quite a few Canadian artists I really like. I'm not saying I don't, but I felt that I missed out on that. I really enjoy like the UK music scene, both nationally and regionally, because over the years I went to so many gigs. So part of the reason for doing this is to go back over the 2010s in music. So I'm going through looking at various albums. I may have even in another episode brought up the little spreadsheet where I pulled down some CSVs from best ever albums and then filtered them based on the UK artists. And I was just looking through here, and some of this earlier part of the year, I do remember, like I can remember listening to this album, and then but like I completely missed out on Fortet, or didn't really explore them. So I've been listening to them, and I also noticed that one of the Gorillaz albums came out this year. Is it Plastic Beach, I think? So that's really good. And Groove Armada's Black Light. Plus a whole load of more extreme stuff. Like there was a Electric Wizard album. I think it's Black Masses came out, and I didn't listen to that, but I did listen to the Absolute Descent album by Killing Joke. And then other things like Winter Filleth as well. They had an album out that year. So I missed out on that at the time. And I missed out on Massive Attack as well. I didn't listen to this album until quite a number of years later. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward going through the 2010s again over the course of the next few weeks and months. And just, seeing what albums I did miss out on because of that, I suppose, culture shift. I don't know why I've got that there. And the other thing in cahoots with that is I'm also looking through programming languages in 2010s, then what came out, and seeing if maybe I do want to sit down and learn some of these, or just kick the tires on them. So I've already taken a look at Rust, but there's some other interesting stuff here like Julia and Kotlin. What was one I saw recently? Oh yeah, Zig, because that came out top of the list in one of the Stack Overflow results, one of their charts as well. So yeah, and things like Ballerina and Bosk and Q Sharp and loads of other things here as well look really interesting. Elm Elixir are all on my to-do lists of programming languages to take a look at. So there we have it. Hopefully you enjoyed my look through 5 things which I really enjoy in IT and 5 things that I do not enjoy so much in IT. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.